Welcome, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for 529 College Savings Plans, simply the smart way to save for college. My name is Kathy Chern, and I am a consumer health librarian at East Brunswick Public Library. Today's program is brought to you by the Libraries Just for the Health of It initiative to promote community health and wellness. Our speaker today is Bradley Basker, financial advisor at Morgan Stanley in Boston. Bradley works with clients to help build a sustainable financial plan to achieve their financial and life goals and manage their assets for them. He is licensed in New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Florida, and Texas. Bradley has already delivered free webinars focused on financial wellness and literacy to companies, synagogues, schools, alumni networks, and public libraries, and enjoys giving back to his communities in this way. Please be aware that this talk is being recorded. Please keep your microphones muted and your webcams off. The recording will be available at ebpl.org/YouTube. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat box. Our speaker will answer questions at the end of the talk. And without further ado, I'll turn things over to Bradley.
Thanks, Kathy, and thank you everyone for being here today. I see a few familiar faces. I think a few of you, I won't name names, have been on all 4 of my seminars that I've done over the last couple of months, and I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy Fridays to be here today. And we're going to talk about a really important topic, and one that's becoming, more and more on top of minds of people, because the cost of college is just so exorbitantly expensive, especially, if you want to send your kid to a private school down the road. Even public school is extremely expensive. So we're going to talk about some of the mechanisms you can do to really put yourself in a position to save up for college for your children, your grandchildren, your nephews, your nieces, etc. We'll talk about how that works. And we'll talk about really the flexibility that goes beyond just a 4-year undergrad, and how 529 plans can actually be used for education beyond sort of that 4-year undergrad experience. Now, in terms of our agenda, give me a second. In terms of our agenda, over the next 45 minutes or so, we're first going to talk about the challenges that students today and in the future are facing when it comes to paying for college. To help you understand the issue, we're going to discuss several misperceptions that many people have today about college planning. Next, we'll discuss the different options that are available to fund a college education, with a focus on the 529 plan. After we've covered all those options, we're going to spend some time focusing entirely on the features and benefits of one option in particular, the reason you're all here today, to talk about 529 plans. And then finally, we'll talk about what you can actually do, whether it's later today, on Monday, in the next few weeks, to get started with a 529 plan, just to get the ball rolling and set yourself up for success when it comes to affording, education in the future. So let's begin. Now, we have found, and I have found specifically, when working with clients, when you start planning for important goals, the actual act of saving the dollars isn't necessarily the hardest part, but actually overcoming some common misperceptions about how and why this is actually important. So let's explore each of these misperceptions one at a time. The first one is the cost of school. As you can see, right, the cost of education is extremely expensive right now. When you look at a private 4-year non-for-profit education, you could be looking at over $50,000 of after-tax money. And that's not just tuition. We're talking about room and board, supplies, books, things like that. Even an in-state 2-year institution could be as much as $17,000, $18,000. And clearly that's going to depend on what state you're in, what school you get sent to. But the point is, if you think about what a 4-year, college education costs, especially if you've got your sights set for your kids on maybe going to, a Harvard or a Columbia or one of these top elite private schools, you're looking at over $200,000 in after-tax money to put them through for 4 years. And at the growth rate of college tuition, as we'll talk about in a little bit, it's really not even $200,000. It's going to be a lot more than that down the road, especially if you have younger kids. Now, let's talk about the real cost of college today. And I'm just going to kind of show you a few different colleges that are around the country to kind of just show you some of the incredible statistics that the Department of Education has put out to sort of get a sense of what you're going to need to get your kid through a 4-year education. So as you can see, in some schools, over 90% are receiving aid, right? Clearly, college education is becoming extremely unaffordable at something that perhaps my parents' generation didn't have to deal with, but it's just getting completely out of hand. And over 90% and many of these schools are getting financial aid. You can also see, what the estimated 4-year cost will be for a bunch of these schools. And it's a lot of money, especially when you consider the fact that it's after-tax dollars, right? So really, if you're thinking about $150,000, let's say, that might mean $200,000 or $250,000, before tax, Because once Uncle Sam takes his money, your money away from you, that's how much you actually need to be able to have to afford a college education. So I just wanted to sort of show you, college is not cheap, right? No matter what kind of direction you go, whether public school, private school, 2-year, 4-year, it's going to add up to something. And that's something you want to think about and talk to your kids about in terms of like, what is the intention for my kid? Obviously, if they're, 1, 2, or 3 years old, you can't sort of think about it from their standpoint. You got to just make the decision for them. But ultimately, it's going to be expensive. We want to put ourselves in a position to be able to afford that, to give our kids or our grandkids, our nephews, our nieces, etc., the ability to go through an education process without being saddled with debt. Now, one concern that comes up time and time again in discussions about 529 plans relates to financial aid. Because a lot of people say, if I set up a 529 plan, does that affect my eligibility for financial aid? And the answer is yes, but less than you might expect, and certainly less than other savings options. So some of you will not qualify for needs-based financial aid, right? You might make too much money to qualify for financial aid. However, should you apply for financial aid, the monies in a 529 account are counted as the parent's assets. They are not counted as the child's assets. And as you can see, a smaller percentage of the family contribution is expected from the parents than from the child to cover the cost of college. So 5.6% of parental assets versus 20% of children's assets. So if you, let's say, had an account in their name that was not a 529 account, a regular, UTMA, UGMA account, a custodial account, their expectation from these financial aid offices is that the child will be able to pay more than they expect the parent to pay. So it's actually better to have a 529 plan when you think about financial aid than sort of an account that's in the child's name in terms of ownership. And as we'll talk about, with a 529 plan, you, the parent, you, the grandparent, whoever opens the plan actually is the owner of the account, even if your child is the beneficiary. It's also important to note, I know there was a question beforehand about grandparents, that grandparent-owned 529 plans are not considered either a parental or a student asset for expected family contribution calculations, but some financial aid offices may require that distributions from grandparent-owned 529 plans be reported as student income when applying for financial aid. And so all I'll say with financial aid is it's complicated. If you have a sense of which school you think your child will ultimately go to, you're going to want to just call that financial aid office and get a sense of how they work and what expectations they have when it comes to doling out financial aid. Now, over the last 20 years, the amount of student loan debt has risen dramatically. And so let's take a quick look at the cost of borrowing money versus saving money for a college education, right? Too many people get to the sort of point where they're like, you know what, I haven't planned in advance for a college education. And so they sort of saddle their kids or their grandkids with student loan debt because you want to get the education. The parents haven't planned ahead. And as a result, they have to take out a student loan. So let's talk about an illustration that shows 3 different scenarios where you can really see the value of starting early, planning ahead, and not putting your child or grandchild in a situation where they have to take out student loan debt. So at the age of 3, we've got 3 children, each pursuing a $75,000 education. Just for the example, we'll keep it simple. $75,000 is what it will cost for each of these 3 children. At the age of 3, the parents of our first child have decided to begin saving for their children's college. So they got 15 years or so to go until they're 18. So to meet their goal of $75,000, they begin investing about $281 per month, which assumes about a 5% after-tax return. They'll have invested about $50,000 over those 15 years to get to $75,000. So they've made about $24,000, $25,000 on their investment. Okay, so to get $75,000, they had to invest about $50,000 over a 15-year period. Okay, not bad, not bad. They didn't have to put up $75,000. They only had to put up $50,000 or so. Our second child has grandparents that wanted to help them plan for college. So using the capital that perhaps they did not need to generate income for themselves in retirement, perhaps they're a little bit more well off, they've got cash on the sidelines, they want to help out, they're able to set aside a lump sum all at once, as opposed to sort of a monthly payment like the parent might do. They set aside a lump sum, and that number is $35,483. Because at that number, assuming a 5% return for the next 15 years, they can achieve their objective of having $75,000 on hand for their grandchild's college education. All right. Now, our third child was on their own. Unfortunately, their parents perhaps couldn't afford to help out, or they just didn't plan in time. So they have to borrow $75,000 to pay for college. And so by the time they graduated 4 years later, the total value of their loans had grown to over $85,000 because the interest starts to accrue immediately. And as soon as they hit their freshman year, you're going to start to see that interest start to add up. Now, if they take 20 years to pay off that student loan, which for some people is reasonable, some people are able to pay it off in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. Let's just say they take 20 years to pay it off, which for some people, depending on what line of work you get into, might be realistic. The student would have to actually pay back almost $150,000. So yes, their education cost $75,000. That's how much they borrowed. But because they weren't able to sort of pay that back in a lump sum or much more quickly, as a result, they're going to end up paying double because of all the interest that accrues over time. And so if you think about it, for one child, the $75,000 education costs $35,000. For another child, it costs $50,000. And for another child, it costs $150,000. And so we really just want to think about that. What does that do to someone in terms of starting their life, getting out of college, starting to earn and accumulate their wealth, but they're saddled with that much debt? It can be really burdensome. And so that's why you're probably all here today is, how do I put myself in a position as a grandparent, as a parent, as an aunt or an uncle, and I want to set someone in my life up so that they don't have to take out that kind of student loan debt. Now, in the previous slide, we talked about achieving about a 5% after-tax return, which is a relatively conservative estimate, given that over the last 100 years, the markets have returned about 10% annually over time. That doesn't mean year to year, it's always 10%. Sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower. But what if you could achieve the same return while taking less risk, or potentially achieve a higher return while assuming the same risk as your taxable brokerage account? So the Morgan Stanley Global Investment Committee recently published a white paper on the benefits of various tax strategies and their effect on investment returns. And our research concluded that after IRAs, 401ks, and other similar retirement plans, the 529 plan actually has the second highest incremental added return per year. And our research shows that if you're saving for future higher education expenses, you're more likely to achieve your desired income in a 529 plan than a taxable account. And why is that? Well, it makes sense. As we'll talk about, 529 plans are shielded from taxes on the growth of the account. And that allows you to keep more money going to work for you and less money going to Uncle Sam. Now, the net effect of all these misperceptions brings us to these realities. Total student loan debt now exceeds $1.6 trillion, and that makes student loan debt the highest consumer debt category, higher than credit card debt, higher than auto loan debt. All of that, student loan debt by far our biggest debt pool in the country. In fact, the average student in the class of 2020 has over $37,000 in student loan debt. Again, a huge mountain to climb if you're someone just starting out your life to have that amount of money to have to pay back. So unless we plan properly, we will continue to add to that debt. And the cost of college is on the rise, as you can see, increasing over 6% per year and outpacing inflation for the last 10 years. Our incomes aren't even growing at 6%. So the cost of college is relatively getting more expensive at a rate that is completely unsustainable. I hope there's a reckoning at some point, given how all these colleges have seen and people have seen that they can do virtual learning. Perhaps they don't need to be paying $50,000, $60,000 a year for an education in person when they could potentially do an equivalent online. So I hope there's a correction coming. I can't promise that'll happen, and it certainly may not happen in the next 10, 15, 20 years. So you don't want to assume that that eventuality will come to be. So we're going to cover a lot of options, but one that we're going to spend the most time on today, and in the name of the seminar, is the 529 plan. Right now, you probably think, oh, the 529 plan is the kids' college savings account. And there's so much to unpack there, right? It's actually not the kids' college savings account. It's your savings account that you can decide to use for your kids. It's not just for college. It can be used for K through 12. It can be used for postgrad. We'll talk about all that. And so as we go through this presentation, I think you will find that the most benefits accrue to you, the owner, you, the grandparent, you, the parent, you, the aunt, the uncle, whoever you're trying to support. Also, a savings account is something you have at the bank. And at Morgan Stanley, we help you invest to reach your goals. So by the end of this presentation, I hope that you realize that a 529 plan is something a little bit different and more nuanced. 529 plan is a tax-deferred investment account that gives you the option, but not the obligation, to spend the assets tax-free on education that grows outside your estate, which is certainly important for people that are a little bit older in life, and remains completely under your control. We'll talk more about that in the next few slides. Now, the good news is we do have a way to help you address these future expenses, as I talked about, right? It's a pretty big mountain that we have to climb, but there is a way to do that. So let's take a few minutes to talk about how to develop a plan, what the options are that are available to you, and the benefits using a 529 plan to help your goal. So given all these options, what's your plan to meet college expenses, right? Hope, as you can see on this slide, is not a plan. I'm just going to hope and pray that, figure this out when I get there. Or you telling your kids, your grandkids, you're on your own is clearly not something you're planning to say, because you wouldn't be here today otherwise. Now, the rest of the strategies listed here are viable for some families and not so viable for others. The important thing is to take action. Decide on a plan, talk with your children about college in realistic terms. Things like how much will tuition cost versus how much they can expect to earn in their chosen career, provided they have a chosen career. What can you really afford to spend? Perhaps that's something you talk with your spouse about if you have one, and your kids, so that they can set realistic expectations. Will you have to limit choices to in-state schools, right? Obviously, in-state public tuition tends to be a lot cheaper than out-of-state public institutions, out-of-state private institutions, in-state private institutions. You might also want to think about setting performance expectations. As they say, there's no such thing as a free lunch, and you're doing your part to provide your children with a good education. So clearly they have to do their part too. So when you have that conversation, I know with my parents, they said, listen, Bradley, we're going to help you pay for college, but our expectation is that you're not going to mess around. You're not going to just join a frat party, drink all the time, and your grades are going to slide. So they let me know that if they're going to help me out, there was an expectation for me to reciprocate in kind. So you're here today most likely because you have a child, you're expecting a child, you have a grandchild or a nephew or a niece, someone who will be heading off to college someday. So you'd like to know the money will be available when that day arrives. So how will you make that happen? A few options that you have at your disposal. The first one is you might forego the idea of saving altogether and simply just pay the bill out of your cash and your income and your cash flow when that day comes. You could also take out a loan for yourself. There are low interest federal student loan programs available for that purpose. And many families choose this option, often adding a personal loan as well. Again, if you can avoid that sort of debt option, I would say that's really the way to go. Refinancing is also a possibility. You might, not really want to tap into the equity of your home if you have more palatable options. But if you needed to, you could take out a home equity line of credit to pay off something like college. Again, not necessarily advisable. You can hope your child gets a scholarship or financial aid. In fact, approximately $155 billion worth of financial aid in the form of grants and low interest loans are available to students today. But of course, scholarships and financial aid are not always that easy to get, so you don't necessarily want to bank on that as an option. And then there are taxable savings plans like a Uniform Gift to Minors Act, also known as UGMA or UTMA, which essentially is an account that perhaps you open with your child where you are the custodian until they reach the age of majority, then it becomes their money. All right. At one time, those were very popular savings vehicles. It's sort of in my parents' generation, but now they're much less attractive than 529 plans, and we'll talk about kind of why that is in the subsequent slide. The final option is, when it comes to college savings accounts, is what's called a Coverdell Education Savings Account, which also has some very significant limitations. We're going to talk about that right now. So this shows how 529 plans compare with other popular college savings vehicles. So here you can see a comparison of 529 plans with UGMA and UTMA custodial accounts. UGMA stands for Uniform Gift to Minors Act, and UTMA stands for Uniform Transfer to Minors Act. And these are both ways of transferring money to a minor without the complications of a trust. So perhaps, you've got a child that had a bar mitzvah when they were 13, perhaps, and they got some money from friends and family. They put in an account. You can't open an account until you're 18. So you kind of, as a parent, you open the account. It belongs to them, but they don't get to touch that money until they reach the age of majority. So as we've seen, 529 plans do offer significant tax savings. But with an UTMA or UGMA account, investment earnings above $2,100 are subject to federal income tax at the parent's rate, and there are no state tax benefits. I'll say that again. If you save for college using one of these custodial accounts, above $2,100 in gains, let's say you make $50,000 on it, you're going to pay income tax at the parent's income tax rate, not the child's income tax rate. So again, you don't have any tax sort of shield as you do with a 529 plan. Now, what's more, the beneficiary of the UTMA or UGMA account assumes control of the money at the age of majority. And so in some states that's 18, some states that's 21. And that means, this is really important as a parent and grandparent to understand, if they decide not to go to college and want to spend that money instead on a car or a vacation or something else, there's absolutely nothing you can do. They own those funds once they hit 18. Now, in contrast with a 529 plan, you never relinquish control of the assets in the plan until you decide it's time to distribute them towards an education expense. Now, let's talk about Coverdell Education Savings Accounts, also really good tax-deferred savings vehicle for college, but there are some limitations with the Coverdell. Number one is that you can only save $2,000 a year per beneficiary, where on the other hand, 529 plans do not have limits on how much you can put away every year in theory. Number two is if you make above a certain income limit, you're not allowed to put money towards a Coverdell. So that's $110,000 for an individual and $220,000 for a couple filing jointly. So again, not eligible to the masses. If you make more than that amount that I just laid out, you're not eligible for a Coverdell, which kind of leads us to the 529 plan, which has all those limitations I just mentioned for the other two options, go by the wayside, and it's extremely flexible, open to all people, doesn't have expiration dates, anything like that. And we'll talk about all the benefits from here on out. So let's drill a bit deeper and see just how these benefits work. And so for starters, there are great income tax benefits to having a 529 plan. Any earnings on the money that you put in a 529 plan are exempt from federal income tax. I'll say that again. Any earnings, let's say you put $50,000 in, and over time that grows to $150,000, that $100,000 of earnings, so to speak, are completely exempt from federal income tax. What that means simply is that, when you make your contributions with after-tax dollars, there is no tax on the returns that you have in the future. Now, when it comes to take the money out when it's time to pay for college, withdrawals are also free from federal income tax as long as they're used for qualified education expenses, such as tuition, room and board, books, supplies, and we'll talk about what a qualified expense is and what the penalty is when you don't put it towards what it's meant to be put towards in education. Now, additionally, in many states, contributions might also be deducted from state income tax. And generally, you'll need to choose a plan that's offered by your home state to qualify for this benefit. So we'll discuss if this benefit is available to you and if it's sort of a significant amount of money you can save in your case. I'll tell you some bad news. The bad news is that New Jersey happens to be one of the states where even if you open a New Jersey state plan, there are no state income tax benefits for you. But in New York, for example, for those of you that are calling in from New York, if you open a plan in New York and you live in New York, you can deduct up to $10,000, $5,000 per person. For a couple filing jointly, it's $10,000. You can deduct up to $10,000 of contributions every year from your state income tax. So in New York, $10,000 at 8.8% state income tax, you could save $880 a year when you kind of do your taxes, you get that money back. So there are benefits to opening your plan in your state. Just so happens New Jersey does not offer that income tax benefit for New Jersey plans. Now, one of the great features of a 529 plan is that it enables you to save money for college while significantly reducing the size of your taxable estate. So again, I know we have a few people that are calling perhaps that are grandparents, are thinking about how do I decrease the estate tax? One day when I pass away and my children inherit my assets, what's a way to decrease my estate tax? So in particular, any contributions you make to a 529 plan are excluded from your estate and therefore not subject to estate taxes. Now, it's important to note that you still control the assets and can access the money at any time. But even if you passed away and the money was in that account, and even though you retain ownership, that money is not considered part of your estate. However, the gains on withdrawals for non-qualified expenses, which means essentially if you take the money out at any time for something that's not considered a qualified expense, let's say you decide to use it, for a vacation when it's in a 529 plan, that's a non-qualified expense. Those would be subject to ordinary income taxes and a 10% penalty. Now, individuals can contribute up to $15,000 per year for each beneficiary without incurring what's called the federal gift tax. And so for a married couple, that amount is actually $30,000, 15 times 2. So for grandparents in particular, this is a big thing because they say, I want to decrease my estate tax. I want to really help my grandchildren out. And I've got all this money. I've made money in my career. I don't need all of it in retirement. They can actually put up to $15,000 per person or up to $30,000 per couple into each of their grandchildren's 529 plans in a given year without any gift tax implications. The gifters don't have to pay taxes. The receivers don't have to pay any taxes. You can do up to $30,000 a year. Now, what's more, there's actually a clause that's called accelerated giving that allows you to make up to 5 years worth of contributions all at once and then nothing for the 5 years after that. So what you would do is essentially multiply $15,000 by 5 years, $75,000 for a couple, that would be $150,000. And you could throw $150,000 for a couple into each of your grandchildren's accounts if you absolutely wanted to in a lump sum. And remember, all that money is out of your taxable estate and it's in a 529 plan. Your grandchildren will forever thank you. And you've now found a way to kind of limit that. And so if you've got 10 grandchildren, let's say, you could fund each of their college savings accounts and remove over $1 million from your taxable estate, but still control the assets. So again, just want to point that out, especially as you get older and you've got more money and you want to help your grandchildren out, putting a sort of a lump sum into a 529 plan is a great way to do that. Now, I mentioned earlier that 529 plans are flexible, and that's another really big plus. 529 plans are available to anyone regardless of income, and there are no maximum ages. So again, doesn't matter if you make $100 million or $100, you are eligible to open a 529 plan and contribute to it. There's no maximum ages, which means You don't have to be a certain age to put money away. There's no expiration date on a 529 plan, whereas with a Coverdell, if the funds aren't used by age 30, there's a penalty on that. 529 plans, there's no expiration. You could, in theory, have it open forever. Now, like I said, plans are offered in almost every state, including Washington, D.C., but the only state that doesn't offer it is Wyoming. So you don't have to choose a plan in your home state. You can choose a plan from any state, regardless of where you live or where the beneficiary goes to college. So a lot of people ask me, if my child wants to go to Harvard in Massachusetts, but I live in New Jersey, can I still open a 529 plan in a different state? The answer is yes, as long as it's an accredited institution. It doesn't matter which state you choose to open a plan in. Now, it's like I said, depending on where you live, we might have folks dialing in from New York, New Jersey, other states. Depending on which state you live in, there might be some in-state tax benefits if you open a plan in your own resident state. And if that's the case, and it's a significant amount, you might want to consider that state tax plan. And I'm happy to discuss specific considerations with each of you offline if you want to know kind of what plan makes sense for you. But you should also consult your own tax advisor and CPA to kind of talk about what that state looks like in terms of tax considerations. Another thing that's great about 529 plans is that there are generous contribution limits with 529 plans. So generally these limits state by state can be anywhere from $235,000 all the way up to $500,000. It just depends on the state. But the point is you can very easily fund an entire 4-year college education. Whereas with the Coverdell I mentioned, you can only put $2,000 a year up until age 18. So you can only contribute $36,000 per child. With 529 plans, if you've got more money, you absolutely can put more money up until $500,000 depending on the state. So don't worry that you can't, you're not going to be able to put as much as you want away as you'd like. And then finally, the money in a 529 plan can be used for accredited private or public colleges, and that includes graduate school, like law school, medical school, business school, certain post-secondary vocational and trade schools, and even some foreign institutions. People ask me, can I use this when my child goes and studies abroad? Can I, go do a summer course for 6 weeks in Italy? Absolutely. As long as it's an accredited institution, you can use it. So it's not just for 4-year undergrad college. It can be for graduate school. And in fact, for many states, the money can actually also be used for K through 12 expenses up to $10,000 per child. Now, New York has a restriction on that. Other states do not. So if hypothetically you wanted to open a 529 plan and use it for your children's education before college, certain states allow you to do that as well. So extremely flexible, as you can see. Now, we started this presentation talking about what you think a 529 plan is, and what you think you should see it as in the future. So this really sums up why we believe that. There are 3 names on every 529 account: the owner, the successor owner, and the beneficiary. And all the benefits that we've described up to now, except actually spending it on college, accrue to you, the owner, not the beneficiary. The beneficiary's benefit is that they get their college in theory paid for. But all the benefits of estate tax, being able to put money away, being able to defer taxes, all that, you still retain ownership. You are the decision maker. You can decide, if you wanted to pull the plug on it altogether and say, you know what, child, you've disrespected me. I'm no longer giving you the money for college. That is at your discretion, not the beneficiary, not the child. So what you'll see there, right, is that there's 3 parts. The owner is you. The successor owner is perhaps your spouse. God forbid you pass away. That spouse or whoever else you designate as the successor owner would take over the account if you were to pass away. And then the beneficiary is, like I said, the person whose sort of name that account is in. And as we'll talk about, you can change the beneficiary up to 2 times a year. So hypothetically, if your one child gets a scholarship or doesn't end up going to college, you can change the beneficiary to be your next child or a nephew or niece or a different grandchild. So we'll talk about that as well. As I said, one of the nice features of 529 plans is that you can name virtually anyone as the beneficiary: your child, your grandchild, a niece, a nephew, a friend, a spouse. And this is the kicker, even yourself. So because I said that you can change a 529 plan's beneficiary down the road, if you don't even have children right now, or someone's expecting but they haven't given birth yet, they can open a 529 plan and make themselves the beneficiary, even though they're also the owner. And then at some point when the child is born, they can change the beneficiary to be that child. If you want to open a 529 plan because you want to go back to school at some point in the future, you can open a 529 plan and make yourself the beneficiary. So it's extremely flexible. I would say most people use it to fund education of their, children, grandchildren. But I've seen people that say, you know what? I plan to go back to get a graduate degree in 5 or 10 years. I'm going to open a 529 plan and I get the same benefits as sort of the standard undergrad 4-year college kid would as well. Now, suppose the beneficiary ultimately decides not to go to college or gets a scholarship. So what happens to the money? A lot of people say, I'm worried about overfunding the account. So that's up to you what actually happens. Remember, as the account owner, you never relinquish control of the money, which should be used and can be used for education expenses. However, again, if the beneficiary decides not to go to college or wins a scholarship, you have several options. Option number one, you can change the beneficiary to someone else. So the standard thing that most people do is they'll change it from child one to child two to child three, grandchild one to grandchild two, nephew one, nephew two, etc. So you can move it around, to a different beneficiary. You can leave the money in the account and let it keep growing tax deferred. Again, just because your child gets financial aid or gets a scholarship or doesn't go to college, who's to say they won't potentially go back for a graduate degree and they might need that? My wife's a perfect example of that. She got a free ride to go to Hunter College in New York City. Her parents had all this money saved up, and as a result, they ended up putting her through a graduate program. She's now getting a master's in dietetics. They're using their 529 plan because they kind of just kept it growing and left it at time. So again, there's no expiration date on 529 plans. Just because they don't go sort of undergrad the way you intended, that doesn't mean you can't leave it in their name and let them use it down the road. You can also withdraw the money up to the value of the scholarship without incurring that 10% federal tax penalty, although ordinary tax still applies to the gain. So let me say that again. Let's say your child gets a scholarship of $30,000 a year. You can take $30,000 out of the account that year, the year that the scholarship was granted. It will still get taxed on whatever gains come out, but you won't pay the 10% penalty that you pay when you take it out for a non-qualified expense. And then finally, you can just outright liquidate the account, in which case all the earnings would be subject to tax as well as the 10% penalty. So if let's say you're like, you know what, all my kids have gone to college, we could use the money for me and my wife to go on a nice vacation or to buy a second home. You could take those $50,000 out, whatever is considered a gain on the account, that'll be taxed and you'll pay a 10% penalty. But you know what, if that's something you want to do, it's absolutely your discretion to do that. So taking distributions, this is really important. And I want to just talk about, again, what is considered a qualified expense and what's not considered a qualified expense and what are the penalties therein. So there are three types of distributions from a 529 plan. First, let's discuss how distributions are calculated. All distributions from 529 plans are issued pro rata, meaning they are part principal, part what you kind of contributed already, and part gain, whatever is appreciated in terms of earnings. And so prior to issuing the distribution, the plan sponsor, so whichever state's plan you use, will calculate what % of the amount is principal and what is the gain. And when they issue that 1099-Q at the year end, the distributee or you will receive that information. Now, if I use the distribution for qualified higher education expenses, then that distribution is qualified and I owe no taxes on the distribution. So that's essentially what I was talking about. That's the bread and butter. You use it for what it was intended to be used for. There's no tax you owe whatsoever on the distribution. Base case. The next case is if I don't use the distribution on qualified expenses, then my distribution is non-qualified. And there's two types of non-qualified expenses. A non-qualified expense that's sort of used for a vacation or to buy a car or something that's really not education related at all, you're going to owe ordinary income tax on the gains plus a 10% penalty on only the gains portion of the distribution. So let's say you take out $50,000 for the wrong reasons, and of that $50,000, $30,000 is considered a gain, $20,000 was principal. The $30,000 is going to get taxed ordinary income tax, and you're essentially going to have to pay $3,000 in a 10% penalty of what you took out. So again, keep that in mind. There is a repercussion to taking it out for a non-qualified expense. Now, no taxes or penalties are ever owed on the return of the principal. So again, if you think about the example I gave, let's say you take all $50,000 out for a non-qualified expense. That $30,000 is subject to the penalty and the taxes, but that $20,000, you already paid taxes on it because it went in having been taxed already. No penalties taking that out. Now, there are three situations where you can make a non-qualified distribution where you'll still owe taxes, but you won't have to pay the 10% penalty. So the three examples are if the beneficiary is deceased or disabled, the 10% penalty is waived. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, if the beneficiary receives a scholarship, then you're able to take a distribution equal to the scholarship amount and pay ordinary income tax on the gains, but no penalty, right? Keep in mind that the distribution must be made in the year the scholarship was given. So if your child is given a scholarship sort of $30,000 for the next 4 years, you can't just say at the end of 4 years, oh, now I want to take out $120,000 with no penalty. You have to take up the $30,000 each year. Now, I have over the next 3 slides a bunch of different scenarios. I don't want to go through all of them just in the interest of time, but I just want to show you a couple of scenarios and sort of talk through, in the Q&A if you have any scenarios that you'd like to run through as well. So our first scenario is a situation where your child has a $75,000 education, they don't get any scholarships, right? So the account is worth $75,000. You put in about $50,000 or so, $25,000 or so was considered a gain. Use the entire account to pay for your qualified education expense. As a result, the owner owes no federal income tax on the gains, and there's no penalty at all. That's sort of like the standard case of you have a 529 plan, no scholarship, use all the funds for the right reasons. Okay, what about a situation where the student receives a scholarship, perhaps 50% of the cost, 50% of the 75,000? So 37,500 is paid to the school, and that's free of state and federal income taxes, as we know. The parents decide, you know what, we do want to take half of that out because the child got the scholarship. We'd like to use the money. They take 37,500 out. Yes, that 37,500 will be partially principal, partially gain. Whatever's the gain will be taxed, but there's no penalty because, again, like I said, you can take an amount out equal to the scholarship. Now, what about the situation which happens a lot? This child gets a scholarship of 50%, but the parents say, you know, we don't want to take the money out. We're going to leave that money in. Perhaps they'll go back for graduate school, or perhaps they'll change the beneficiary down the road to another sibling. All right. So what happens is the 37,500 gets paid to the school, and that remainder of 37,500 gets left in the account and continues to grow tax deferred. No implications whatsoever from a tax standpoint, from a penalty standpoint. So I've got more scenarios that I can cover. I'm not going to go through all of them. But again, in the Q&A, I would love for any of you, if you've got a situation you'd like to ask me about, please feel free to ask that. Now, depending on the specific plan, you can choose from a range of investment strategies suited to your specific needs, objectives, and time frame. So some typical allocation strategies include, this is the most popular one, the first one, the age-based or years to enrollment. That's what I just did for my daughter, who just was born 11 weeks ago. I put her in an age-based portfolio. And how this works is these are diversified portfolios comprised of stocks and bonds, mutual funds, and these portfolios are automatically rebalanced. As the beneficiary ages, the allocations shift to be more conservative and more money in bonds and money market holdings and less in stocks, which tend to be more volatile and aggressive. So essentially, it's managed knowing that she's got 18 years to get to college. In the beginning, she can deal with short-term volatility. And as a result, it invests it heavily, if not 100% in stocks. As she gets closer to 18, they're going to move more towards conservative investments. The balance might be closer to 70-30, 50-50, 30-70, closer towards bonds and money market instruments. Single fund is essentially, it allows account owners, so like you, to create their own allocation strategy by selecting from any funds that you want to put X number of dollars in. You get to put it in the underlying mutual fund that the plan offers, and that's not going to get rebalanced. That's not going to change over time. You're going to have to kind of dictate where the money moves around over time. So someone that's perhaps a little bit more savvy and they want to choose their own funds, you absolutely could do that. Most people do the age-based fund just because, again, it gets taken care of by the plan sponsor, and they're doing the constant rebalancing over time. The last one I want to talk about, for those of you that are perhaps a little bit less risk takers and more conservative, is you can do what's called the guaranteed fund. That strategy eliminates most risk. And so while you receive a guaranteed rate of return, that strategy also has generally a lower rate of return. So you might guarantee yourself maybe a 2 or 3% return. That's guaranteed. But what if the market's up 10% over the next 15 years? You're going to be leaving a lot of money on the table. So, again, just because there's a guarantee in terms of the return doesn't necessarily mean that the guarantor, the state, the plan, there's always a chance they could sort of go bankrupt. It's unlikely. So there's a guarantee in terms of as long as they're in business, here's the return you're going to get. But again, there's a huge downside in sense of if the markets do really well over that 10 or 15-year period, you're going to be losing out on the potential upside. Now, as the account owner, you can specify how you want your assets to be invested, as I just mentioned. Once you have your initial allocation, so let's say you make your first contribution of $1,000 into the plan, you can direct subsequent contributions as you save over time to any portfolio at any time. So just because you've put $1,000 initially into one fund, you can always put subsequent contributions into any other funds you want. Most people just put, their money into one fund, the age-based fund, but you could always sprinkle it around to the different options that the plan offers. Now, in terms of money that's already in an account, right, or in a fund, you can reallocate those funds in your account twice every calendar year or whenever you change beneficiaries. So let's say I put my daughter's initial contribution of $1,000 in an age-based fund, but I realized, I want to put it in a small cap stock fund. I can do that with what's already been in the account twice a year. Or in the future, if let's say I change the beneficiary to be another child, that also enables me to potentially change the investment mix. So I don't want you to think about it like every month I'm going to change where the money is invested. That's not allowed. You can do it up to 2 times a year, or whenever you change the beneficiary, you have the ability to do that. Now, this slide just kind of shows you that age-based mentality of, based on the age that they are and the amount of years that they have until they get to college, we're going to invest with more risk in the beginning and less risk as we go further into the future and closer to college. So you can see here, sort of in that age-based 0 to 4 age window, 85% of the portfolio is invested in stocks, 15% in bonds. On the flip side, as we move left to right, once you get close to 18, right, they're about to go to college, they're in college already, you can't afford for the account to completely plummet because there's a market correction or recession. You're going to be mostly the other direction, 95% bonds, 5% stock. You might even be in money market funds. But the point is you don't have the appetite and the time horizon to let yourself deal with sort of the fluctuations in the account. So we'll typically see people move to much more conservative investments. Now, with plans available in nearly every state, like I said, in District of Columbia, how do you shop for the right plan? What criteria do you apply? It's just pretty overwhelming to sort of go at this process. The fact is, selecting the plan that best meets your objective takes educated advice. And so that's where, I work with clients to kind of figure out where do they want to potentially open a plan? How much are they looking to save? And we think about kind of which plans are available and how much you need to be able to save now to be able to afford college. We'll give you a projection based on whether you think private school, public school, 4 years, 2 years, when you think the school, when the child's going to matriculate to college, and essentially say, based on that, based on the growth rate of what tuition costs, here's where we think you need to be saving every month to fully afford college. If let's say you say, Bradley, I want to save $100,000, anything above that, my child's on their own, we'll essentially build a projection to say, okay, to afford $100,000 using a certain assumed market return, here's how much you need to be putting away every single month to reasonably get to that $100,000 number. So that's something that we do. It can be very overwhelming to do on your own. And I'm happy to work with each of you if you'd like to kind of figure out what the right mix would be. Now, I just want to say one more thing before we kind of wrap this all up. I talked about state income tax benefits when picking a plan. And again, for those of you that are in New Jersey, state income tax benefits are nothing. So it's not as appropriate. But if you're in New York or in any other state, like I'm from Massachusetts, beyond the state income tax benefits, you probably are saying, well, if I don't have state income tax benefits, what else should I consider? And I have to say the big thing to look at is performance. Every state has hired a bank like Morgan Stanley, Fidelity, Vanguard to manage their plans. And you can look at what the performance of their different funds have done over time because they're actively managing that. And so you want to see kind of which states' plans have performed the best. If the average return of the New York plan has been 8%, let's say in one of their funds, and the equivalent fund in South Carolina has been 6%, well, that 8% over time compounded year over year is going to make a big difference in terms of what the value of the account is. So looking at performance of the different states' plans is a really good place to start. Just for context, I opened a plan for my daughter, even though I live in Massachusetts, where there is a small tax benefit. I opened in New York because when I did my research, I discovered that New York has consistently been in the top 3 in the country on a 1, 3, 5, and 10-year basis in terms of their performance. It also just so happens that I might move to New York at some point, and so having that income tax benefit in the future is nice, but I did it because New York has been consistently high performing in terms of the returns. Other things you might want to look for are service, right? When you call them up and say, I want a distribution to pay off, how easy is that for you to do that? You can do some research online. There's a great website called savingforcollege.com. They compare all these different plans. Their ratings based on costs and returns and service and quality, et cetera. You can kind of do your homework there. So early in the presentation, I talked about how I wanted to change your perception of a 529 plan account, because many of you probably just said, oh, it's the kids' college savings account. And I hope you agree after our discussion here today that it's potentially much, much more. It's much more flexible. The ownership is yours. You can move the money around. It's really not your child's savings account. It's your account, and you can choose how you want to spend it with regard to education. I want to thank you all for being here today. I know we've got a nice, robust crowd, a lot of returning faces. Thank you to Kathy and the East Brunswick Public Library for having me again. If you'd like to reach out to set up a 529 plan, I just opened one up for someone who attended a recent seminar. It's a very easy process. I'm happy to work with each of you on that. Get it up and running, get it going, and start saving towards an education. So here's my number, my email. You can just Google my name at Morgan Stanley. You'll find my website. That's a great way to get in touch with me. And Kathy will probably follow up with my contact information as well. So I'm going to turn the floor back over to Kathy at this point and open the floor up for questions from the audience. Thank you all for being here again today.
Great, thanks a lot, Bradley. So I had some questions that were emailed to me earlier. So how much should a grandmother put in the 529 monthly to pay for college? And which Vanguard plan is best? They have the least to most aggressive plans.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and if you're on the call, I'd love a little bit more context if you care to share. But the question, the answer to that is it's going to depend. You have to tell me what you're trying to save up toward, and we can back into, based on assumed market returns and based on some different scenarios, how much you would reasonably be able to put away to achieve that goal. I gave the example of that $100,000. If you say, I want to make sure that my child has $100,000 or grandchild has $100,000 in 10 years time, we can back into, okay, based on this monthly contribution schedule and an assumed 8% return, here's what you need to put in every single month. If you want to do a lump sum, we could do the same thing and say, okay, if you started with $30,000 today and just let that run, what would that turn into in 15 years time? So there's no one exact answer unless you tell me kind of how much you're willing to ultimately put down versus how much you want it to be worth in the future. And then in terms of the plans, I don't know specifically which state Vanguard oversees. It's going to depend state by state. But again, if your child is further away from college, or grandchild, if they're 0 to 4, 0 to 6, you could go more aggressive. If they're closer to being college age and you don't have as much time to deal with sort of some downfalls in the market, you might want to go a little bit less aggressive. And like I said, New York, I can speak from experience, has 31 different funds you can choose of different levels of aggression. Not every state has that. Some states only have 6 different funds. So again, if you've got a specific example in mind that you'd like to reach out to me about, feel free to do that. Or if you want to expound on that in the Q&A, please do that as well.
Okay, thank you. And so another question, should both the parents and grandparents open a 529? And how does this affect the student's aid and et cetera?
Yeah, it's a good question. So as I said sort of on one of the earlier slides, if a parent opens a 529 plan, it's considered a parent asset and is included in sort of the equation for what the expected family contribution is, up to 5.64% of the parent's total assets. So it's going to be counted. It's not something that gets ignored when the financial aid office looks at, what you can reasonably afford as a parent. As a grandparent, though, it's not considered an asset of the child or the parent. So that's actually kind of nice. They don't sort of look at that. But when they do some calculations, and again, this gets complicated, once they start to use the funds, let's say you distribute $25,000 for that grandchild, that's considered income, and that becomes part of the income of the child, and that becomes part of the equation. But in terms of sort of that initial expected family contribution, grandparent-owned 529 plans have no bearing on financial aid.
And then another question, I file returns in both New Jersey and New York as I live in New Jersey but work in New York. So would I be able to get the New York tax benefit?
So that's a great question. And I would say we should probably follow up on that and maybe ask your tax advisor. That's the first time I've heard that question. My expectation is that when I talk about, residence, that means it's where you live, not necessarily where you work. So my gut on that is that it would not allow you to open a 529 plan in New York to get the income tax benefits. Obviously, you can open the plan in New York, no problem. But I think it's dependent on where you ultimately live in terms of home address. But if you want to reach out to me, I can do some more homework on that and get you a definitive answer.
Oops, new question. Are there any repercussions about parents contributing to a parent-owned 529?
You just cut out for a second. Can you say that one more time?
Sure. Are there any repercussions about parents contributing to a grandparent-owned 529?
None at all. Not at all. Now and absolutely, the contributions can still be tax deductible. Again, if it's sort of that resident in-state plan, but you absolutely can make contributions to a grandparent-owned plan. So that might make sense, especially from what I was talking about with the financial aid repercussions. Having in the grandparents' plan might make a lot of sense. We typically see it go the other direction. We typically see grandparents who want sort of money to go out of their estate make contributions the other direction, but there's absolutely no reason to sort of do the reverse. So sorry, there's absolutely no reason not to do the reverse if that's something you want to do.
Okay.
If both have a 529, can you move parent to grandparent 529? I'm not sure I understand the example, but are you asking if the funds can be transferred? Got it. So yeah, so the reality is you're not allowed to change ownership of account of 529 plans unless someone passes away. So if, let's say, there's $50,000 in a parent-owned account for a beneficiary and $50,000 in a grandparent-owned for a beneficiary, you wouldn't be able to just move the $50,000 from the parent-owned one into the grandparent-owned one. The only thing you have the flexibility to change is the beneficiary. So you can't actually move the assets out of the 529 plan. You can only just change the beneficiary. And one question people ask me is, should I, if I have multiple kids, should I open one plan, save for all them, save for the first child, see what's left over, then change the beneficiary to the next child, and so on and so forth, and just sort of save as if I'm planning to save for, 4 kids? What I would say is I typically don't recommend that, only because you're going to want to save for the different children based on, let's say you go with the age-based approach. The way that the portfolio is going to be managed for your child who's perhaps 4 years old is going to be different than it would be saved for a child who's 10. And so when you're managing the account for the 10-year-old all the way till they're 18, and then you're like, okay, now I'm going to change it to be managed for the 14-year-old, the account might be a little bit too conservative for the 14-year-old, and you've kind of missed out on potential gain. So I typically see one 529 plan per beneficiary. Sometimes parents will open a joint account for 529 plans, but the beneficiaries typically get their own 529 plan.
Yeah.
Question is it best to just the grandparent to do this? I wouldn't necessarily say is it best, but I think from a financial aid standpoint, there are advantages to grandparents doing that. It might just get a little bit complicated when it comes time to distribute and write the check to the school and all that. You'd have to essentially have the grandparent every single time do the authorizations. The parent wouldn't be able to make the call, because if a parent does the 529, it works against the child's benefits. Yeah, so that would be a benefit. I think from a convenience standpoint, it wouldn't necessarily be. And for people that don't expect to get financial aid, there aren't really many benefits. But if you're thinking of getting financial aid based on sort of income and qualification, then I think putting a 529 plan in the grandparent's name makes a lot of sense.
Are managed plans state-based?
So I need a little bit of clarification on the question. Are you asking if if you, let's say, work with an advisor? I'll just wait for a clarification. Got it. Okay. So if you wanted to work with an advisor, I'll just give you an example, Morgan Stanley, because that's where I work. The only plan that we actually manage actively, and so you say I want to entrust Morgan Stanley with managing the funds, is the North Carolina plan. All the other states, even though we'll broker 529 plans for our clients in those states, for example, the 529 in New York, which I opened, I got to choose the fund that I wanted to put the money in, but JP Morgan happens to be the plan sponsor for New York State, right? New Jersey has Franklin Templeton, Massachusetts is Fidelity. And so those companies manage those funds. But if you wanted, let's say, me to help you figure out which fund to choose within, let's say, JP Morgan's New York plan, I can look through that with you and help you make that decision. But I wouldn't be the one saying, I think, this should be the composition of the mutual funds. That's going to be JP Morgan. That's going to be Franklin Templeton, et cetera. They are the ones that actively manage the funds. But if you want Morgan Stanley to manage your funds, the one plan that we do administer happens to be North Carolina. So happy to talk with you about that as well.
So thanks again, Bradley, for taking the time to present on this topic and answer our questions and to do this financial wellness series with us. And next week, the library will be presenting a talk with St. Peter's University Hospital called Better Exercise, Best You. So Bonnie Saunders, physical therapist, will explore the various reasons and motivations to exercise and connect these to the various types of exercise. So this talk will take place next Friday, March 5th at 12 p.m. noon. For more information or to register, check the library's event page at ebpl.org/calendar. And thank you everyone for joining us for today's talk, and take care and stay safe. All right, thank you.